Welcome to everyone to this event this evening on Theologies of Mental Health. We are going to be talking with some wonderful theologians in just a few minutes. I wanted to express a welcome to all of you for being here with us, especially those of you who might be new to Holy Trinity Catholic Church or to our community. We're glad you're with us today. We hope that you think of us as a virtual home here in the Washington, D.C. area for our Jesuit Catholic parish. And also a special welcome to all of our parishioners here, whose attendance, whose ministry, whose support of our parish makes everything that we're doing possible. Before I introduce our moderator for the evening, I'm going to ask us to begin with just a moment of prayer. So if you were running to get onto the Zoom, if you were running to finish one last thing before you opened it, take a moment now just to be present. If you feel comfortable closing your eyes, feel free to do so as you wish. And the prayer that I'm going to be using is from a handbook from the Spiritual and Mental Health Ministry of the Diocese of Honolulu in Hawaii. God, we celebrate the gift of life for each person. We commit to nurturing the well-being of each person here. We know for some life is filled with suffering. Help us to talk about our fears, our anger, and our despair with someone we trust. We celebrate that life has purpose and meaning, but for some, purpose and meaning are like dry bones, dead and lifeless. Remind us that you know us by name. You know our place and purpose in this world. We are created to live in community, yet some feel alone, unloved, and disconnected. Give us courage to reach out with love to someone who needs us. May we be your presence with them. Teach us to be gentle and non-judgmental. Help us to remember those who ended their lives before it was time. Comfort those who grieve and bring us all healing. And we ask this in your name. Amen. It's my joy to begin this evening. Move this right here to introduce my friend and colleague in the world of theology and ecclesiology, Dr. Annie Selak. Dr. Selak is a Catholic feminist theologian who serves as the director of the Women's Center at Georgetown University. She's a parishioner here at Holy Trinity, and you can often see her at the 9 a.m. Hall Mass with her family. So Annie, please take it away for us this evening.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to be with you all. And even better to have two of our panelists here together. Dr. Stephanie Edwards and Dr. Jessica Coblentz are long friends of mine, and their books are always on my bookshelf and some of my most loaned out books to students. So we'll begin tonight with an introduction of our speakers. And then our goal tonight really is to engage in conversation around these topics. We know that something like theologies of mental health. I mean, we could do 8-hour days on this for an entire year and not explore it all, right? So our hope in kicking off this series is to surface some of these questions of why do we talk about theology of mental health from a faith perspective? What does trauma-informed mean? Where are we going with this? With two experts in theology, and we hope to do this in conversation with one another. And then I invite you throughout to put questions in the chat. At the end of the evening, I'll moderate the chat and raise some questions there. Of course, we won't be able to get to everything, but my hope is I'll be able to combine them and include a lot of different insights from the group. So to begin, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Jessica Coblentz is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And this semester, she's a visiting scholar at the Center for Theological Inquiry in Princeton, New Jersey. She's the author of Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression, and co-editor of 2 volumes, including the forthcoming Women Responding to the Spirit, Selections from the Madaleva Lectures. We're also joined by Stephanie Edwards, who is the director of the Boston Theological Interreligious Consortium, also called the BTI, and she teaches in Faith, Peace, and Justice program at Boston College. She's a Catholic ethicist and a social worker, practicing diverse service delivery and nonprofit management for 15 years. Her first book, Enfleshed Counter-Memory, A Christian Social Ethic of Trauma, was published by Orbis Press in November 2024, and she's the editor of a volume of Young Catholic Scholars Engaging Trauma, due out summer 2026. So to begin our conversation tonight, I want to start with an overarching question. I think we can all agree that mental health is a crucial topic in today's world. But why is it a crucial topic for churches to discuss? Basically, like, why don't we just leave this all to the psychiatrists and psychologists? Why is a faith perspective important in this topic?
Thanks so much, Annie. I'm happy to begin in response to your question. Before I do, I just wanted to say thanks for all who've come and for the welcome from Holy Trinity. In terms of why a Christian perspective on mental illness is important, why a theological perspective on mental illness is important, the first reason I think is a rather obvious one, which is that if we actually listen to a lot of people who are living with mental illness, many of which entail a great deal of suffering, a lot of them are raising really profound theological questions that are distinctly theological. So in my own work on depression, for example, I often hear from Christian depression sufferers that their experiences raise genuine questions about, like, where is God? Why is this happening to me? And oftentimes those questions arise in a way that really leads people to question their previous ideas about God, their previous ideas about who they are in relation to God and the church. And I think the church should have something to say in response, especially to people who are rendered so vulnerable by these conditions. Secondly, I think that if we don't invest in robust Christian theological conversations about mental illness, we will resign people who are suffering to whatever they can absorb from the messages that they hear in the world around them and in the church around them. Often what they receive from their Christian community is silence on this matter, which is telling, right? That sends a message to people. If the kinds of experiences that they're having are not apparently worth talking about in their faith communities. Sometimes too, people are reading into offhanded messages or offhanded, remarks that people make about mental illness, things they read online. They might happen upon life-giving Christian messages, but it's not hard to imagine that some of what people are encountering around mental illness in faith circles may not be very life-giving. And so I think it's our job as people of faith, particularly those of us in Christian theology, to give people who are asking theological questions, who are turning to their faith communities for support, some resources to think with that are life-giving and relevant.
Thanks, Jess. I agree with everything you said. And thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks to Annie and Brian for having us. Social worker in me, I'm gonna call out what Brian just put in the chat. This can be heavy. It can bring up a lot of things that are very personal to you. And we have some resources listed there. So if you need to write that down, step out and take care of yourself, please do so, because this is can be unwieldy and it can come up in ways that we're not expecting. In response to what Jess said, I'm really informed by a German Catholic priest and theologian, Johann Baptist Metz, who grew up and was conscripted for think, a total of 2 weeks as a 16-year-old into the Nazi army. And in 2 weeks, the war ended. And very devastatingly so for him. He'd been sent to give a message from his battalion, which at the time were made up of everyone that you lived with from your hometown. And he came back to find them all dead. They had been bombed by the Allied forces, and he was the only survivor. So these were people he lived with his whole life. He's young, very uninterrogated involvement in a very devastating war, of course, and grows up to become a theologian and a Catholic priest. And his main question is, what if I want to take that experience to the psychologist and to the church? What does it mean that I want to take this question to the church and have them respond seriously to it, and not, to Jess's point, respond with cliches or platitudes or just sheer discomfort? Because while that's an extreme example, the moral complicity a lot of people feel in their own mental health suffering can make it really, at best, awkward, and at worst, a true barrier to healing and health, in which they keep it bottled inside, because when they start to surface any of that to even a trusted person, a response is at maybe discomfort, or, oh, I can't help you with that, or even well-meaning care and scripture and all these good things can have unintended consequences. And so for me, like I said at the beginning, this is very practical side of me says I want to equip the church and the people in it specifically with tools. So when someone comes to them, when someone exposes a really vulnerable part of themselves, you feel like you can hold that with them and can say, I can be here with you to discuss making meaning again, like Jess said, to try to hold you in community and have you feel like we're not letting you go despite how difficult this is. And again, you're going to hear this a lot from me, very practical note. Those in church communities are sometimes the first to hear about someone's experience, and that person's response, we have measured, has a really direct line to their success in seeking outside support and treatment that is ultimately likely what they also need as part of their healing journey. So that is a bit of why I think we're here today.
Yeah, so when I think about the sense of, we show up at church as our whole selves, right? Like we shouldn't need to leave part at the church door. At its best, the church should be a place where we show up our full selves. Um, and then, Jess, you were talking about, how if the church is silent around this, like if people are looking at the church for a response and there's silence, we turn to other areas for cliches or just maybe dominant trends, right? We can all think of like the Hallmark card, or I think of like the signs that I had growing up in my house of like, God won't give you anything you can't handle. I just wish he didn't trust me so much, right? That there's these things that are out there. And this has actually been part of your research, right? Like looking at spiritual autobiographies and things like that, and looking at how mental illness is talked about in theology. So, can you share with us some of the popular theologies of mental illness, and also maybe what might be a side of it that maybe people haven't considered? Maybe people have the signs like that up in our houses right now, right? What might be aspects of that fall short or fall hollow?
Yeah, happy to, Annie. My research on depression, which started about a decade ago, arose in part because I recognized that this was a condition that was really prevalent, that I was dealing with, that a lot of Catholics and other Christians that I knew were dealing with. But I found that, at least in the world of academic theology, there was very little that had been written on it. Furthermore, when I looked to my own faith communities, and I had wonderful faith communities in many ways, I wasn't hearing much talk about it. And so this seemed like a curious void. Before I dove fully deep into my own thinking about theologies of depression, though, I did find that online, in self-help books, and as you mentioned, Annie, in some sort of Christian autobiographies of mental illness and depression, there were sort of implicit theologies that were emerging as people wrestled with their illness and their Christian faith. So in my research, I kind of talk about two major categories of what I call popular theologies of depression. I was looking specifically at depression, but I think a lot of these theologies pertain to other ways of thinking about mental illness from a Christian perspective. And perhaps Steph can speak more to how they map onto ways of talking about trauma as well. The first way that Christians tend to talk about depression is to frame it as a sin or the result of sin. This way of thinking about depression tends to be most popular in Pentecostal and evangelical circles. And so often people who believe that a sign of a strong faith is joy, this is something our Pope tends to say sometimes, or, you know, the fruits of the Spirit, for example, one of them is joy. People sometimes interpret those messages about Christian joy to mean that if you are not happy and energized and excited all the time, in other words, maybe because you have depression, you don't feel that way, that must be a sign of your disobedience to God. So the depression itself is a sin. Others, particularly those who might be operating out of a sort of prosperity gospel mindset where they think, you know, if I do good, then God will reward me with happiness. They tend to think that if you're depressed, it must be because God is punishing you for some sort of sin that you did. These views are very prevalent, and I think there are good reasons for why some people are drawn to this way of thinking. For one, it sort of implies that if you repent from sin, right, if you try to be a better Christian, then that will protect you from depression, or it will heal your depression. And that sense of kind of agency can give a lot of people hope. On the other popular theology, which is more common in Catholic circles, people tend to think of depression as a sort of gift from God, or a sort of test that God is giving a person in order to help them grow spiritually. And so this actually frames depression as a good thing, which at first might seem counterintuitive if you know how difficult depression is. But as I said, Catholics often talk about depression this way when they say that it's a cross that God has given me to bear that's going to make me stronger, that's going to teach me something, or it must be happening for a reason, and I just don't know what it is, but God is going to help me grow. And again, this is a popular theology that many people say helps them sort of persevere, right? Because it sort of implies that your response to depression should just be sort of like to resign to it, to wait it out, and wait for God to show you the purpose behind this, right? So as I said, both of these theologies have their appeal. Both of them give depression some sort of purpose in God's great plan. However, I think all of us, if we stop to think about it, can see some of the potential shortfalls of these ways of thinking, right? Often people try to be a good Christian and their depression persists, right? Not everybody comes out of depression having learned something and grown spiritually, right? Some people do not come out of these illnesses at all. And so for those who these do not track with their experience, they don't track with their image of God, they don't actually help them in a practical way, I think we need to offer them something else, right? These are limiting in that sense. And so part of my work as a theologian working on depression has been to try and look to the scriptures, look to the history of theology to sort of mine resources that help us frame depression differently, as potentially a condition that doesn't necessarily have a purpose or inherent meaning, but nevertheless matters to God, a God who cares and is present to our suffering, even if it doesn't have some clear purpose in our lives. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind, right? Some of these theologies are really helpful to people, but we shouldn't assume that the theology that's helpful to me is going to be helpful to others, which is just one more reason why I think we need more theological reflection on depression and other kinds of mental illness.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm connecting this with how Steph previously mentioned, like, okay, I'm going to keep bringing up practice, right? And all the three of us are feminist theologians, and so that connection of practice and theology is central, right? And Steph, I'm really curious about your role as a social worker and your role as a theologian, right? And how, in fact, like those two areas can really bring together a lot of these topics that we're discussing. So from these perspectives, what do you see as some of the problems, but then also some of the potential of discussing theologies of mental health?
Yeah, I think this is really important because neither Jess nor I, and I know Annie, we've known each other since the year of our Lord, 2003, 2004. So we can say this confidently about each other. We're not ones to overstep or to claim a triumphal view of solution to very complex problems. I think part also of our shared feminist theology is a dedication to process and to sitting with emerging theologies and emerging answers rather than rush towards a one-size-fits-all type of solution. So I think what Jess was raising is one of our key guidelines when you're doing any type of just even supportive listening. I'm sure some of you have tried to practice this with your spouse or maybe with your kiddos. To great challenge, I can speak for myself, when you need to sit with their story and you need to simply be with it rather than rush towards a theology or an explanation or a to-do list that you see so clearly as the answer to what they're presenting you with. And it can be deeply difficult when that person is in pain, when that person is experiencing something truly devastating, and you do feel like you have something to offer. And what I think is a joy in this work is the strength of a mysterious God, a triune God that's moving and is always ever present and also ever mysterious, that we can say, I'm going to take that vision of God accompanying us in this space and say that we're not going to solve what we're here exploring today, but we're going to be with each other in it. And I think that that is next level human. That's what I tell my students when I teach conflict transformation, because it's so difficult to be uncomfortable. It's so difficult when you know that you have something to offer someone to not rush towards that offering and to really sit with the person who's in pain. And that's a gift we have, right? That's a strength I think that our faith gives us, that prayer gives us, that ritual gives us, that liturgy gives us. We have these beautiful spaces that are not appropriate in a doctor's office. We have these beautiful, more expansive ways of making meaning together that I think are just absolutely gorgeous. I wouldn't do theology around mental health and trauma if I didn't believe that deeply. I will say that we have a tendency to need an explanation at the end of even that sitting with. So we can maybe, if we've done it for a long time, and we can say, okay, I did it, I sat with it, but also it's a test from God and you're gonna be okay. And you're like, oh, so close. You came within an inch of getting to the end. And that is such a natural and normal. And I don't want to pretend like we're out here doing evil. It totally makes sense. But it's also a big pitfall when we're doing mental health theologically, because mental health does not always have a theological solution. It also, as you all know, theology, and especially the Catholic Church, has done a lot of harm by negating the real mental health and abuse of people and of children. And so to replicate that type of rhetoric in the name of God is devastating, because what we know about the human person, when we talk in the medical and social work field, if you've ever done this yourself, we talk about the biology, psychology, social, your social environment, model of assessment. Now, often we add spiritual to that. So when you're doing an intake with someone, when you're hearing their story in a service setting, you add that to understand the complexity of their pain, but also some potential resources that might not come up in those other three categories. And that's gorgeous, and I love this. But again, we as theologians, as people of faith, may, out of well-intention, think that we can add a bit more to that person's healing process than might be appropriate at that stage. That might be we might overstep our role slightly when we're getting a disclosure for the first time, or when someone is in crisis. And so I think there's, again, these beautiful resources, but also these risks that we need to be really careful about. And I think that one, conversations like this, and then two, building a really practical resource network within your parish, within your local community, within the leadership, lay and clergy of your church, becomes the community that can really hold the totality of the mental health experience, the theological and the very practical safety measures and medical needs that a lot of people are going to come into the space with.
Well, and hearing that need to sit with people, right? And sit there, and then also that very real desire to be like, okay, but also can I make this come to completion? It reminds me honestly of the synod in the Catholic Church, and like this ecclesiological moment that we're in now. And last night Holy Trinity had a session on the synod, but it's the sense of like trusting that God is present among us and working among us, and that we don't have all the answers, that like it's embedded in everyone, and that sometimes we can't wrap it up nicely. Right, like sometimes like we can't just put a bow on it and end it. And not that that will never come. Like I hope that there's some completion that comes, but that's not the current moment. So, of course, as an ecclesiologist, I'm going to make that thing. But it also reminds me of, I mean, so far we've talked about this in more of like an individualistic or a personal way. And I think that is solid, and there's a lot of good reason for that. And I think the Catholic dimension of our faith also can call to light, like, what is the collective dimension of this? And not in a like pathologizing way, right? But just in a like very like what's the collective dimension of this? So like, how do you think about, I don't know whether it's like collective memory and forgetting or communal suffering, but like, what are the resources to help the church think about this as a church?
Steph, I feel like you got to kick this off. It's collective. It's in the title of your book.
Oh God, Jess. All right. Yeah, hold it up, Annie. Thank you. Available at orbis.com. No, okay. So this is essential for me. So I moved quite quickly from individual like clinical work into communal and community organizing spaces in my social work career. Part of that is because I don't have the therapeutic gift, and we have to recognize the gifts we are not given. And secondarily, I really was feeling this lack of attentiveness to what we call like structures of evil, structures of sin, but also structures of healing and health. I was feeling really bogged down by that individualized hyper focus and was seeking something that could help us do this work together. And one of the reasons I grab onto memory in my work is because I really think memory is a beautiful link between Catholic theology and theology writ large, Christianity writ large, and the experience of mental health, and in my research, particularly trauma. Trauma often being, if it's a disease in a person, a disease of the memory, misordered memory. And for me, that just sparked something beautiful with how, especially in the Catholic tradition, we structure our time together each week. Do this in memory of me, that we are together explicitly to not leave any memory behind, to call forth the Christ that is in solidarity with all who suffer, and to not do so in a victimizing, self-flagellating, repetitive of pain intent. No. To flip that and say that despite the ultimate challenge that mental health and trauma can be for some, that its memory can be a source of agency and power, to Jess's point. Something that Jess talks about beautifully in her book, and I take very seriously, are acts of what she calls small agency. That there don't need to be these huge, epic, I threw myself a parade for my healing today. It's often expressed in these really beautiful, very small moments. And to me, when I go to Mass and I experience the Eucharist with my community, that is it's small agency, right? The act itself, think about it, it's very small, it's little, but also it's everything. It's really huge and can be this point where if I can't put the memory into words, if I can't put the experience into sharing, I can do an act of memory with my community that draws them into my experience without explicitly even sharing my own pain, without explicitly having to bear wounds I might never be ready to share in this setting. And I think that that's where I get into the communal ethic of it all, because I think that that's something that communities can take seriously without having to draw someone on stage and say, this one hurts. Look at it. Now pray. Like, that's deeply unhelpful usually. And we often don't want to do that to people who are going through the darkest moments of their lives. Instead, if we take our theologies seriously, particularly of that of our sacraments, we can already participate in a healing moment, in a moment of memory that, again, we don't need to fully understand, that we might not ever fully understand what we're giving to someone in that moment. And I'm an ethicist, so not a liturgical theologian. So the end of the book is like, go do the work. And like lots of suggestions for community building and community development. But in this context, when we're talking about theology and how we hold things collectively, I can't not go to the Eucharist. I can't not go to Mass. Jess, what do you think?
I love what you have to say, Steph, and I think especially one of the gifts of your research, and something I've learned a lot from your thinking, is about these possibilities for collective healing that I think our faith communities are uniquely positioned to step into and offer. In terms of the relationship between the collective and mental illness, one thing I could say a little bit more about are the ways that kind of collective or social realities contribute to many mental illnesses in ways that we don't often acknowledge. So, Steph, you were talking about the sort of biopsychosocial spiritual framework that many people use in clinical settings to think about mental illness. I have found often for for those of us who work outside of the mental health clinic, that it's easy to think about mental health or a mental illness as an individual problem because we think about it, we tend to think about it as a biological problem, right? There's something's wrong with the chemicals inside my brain, right? Or maybe if we've had a great therapist, we might think about it as a matter of my individual cognitive patterns, the ways that I think that lead me to be depressed. Again, very individualistically. And I think often in wider conversations, we forget that social element that clinicians are also attentive to, and that I think researchers in mental health and activists are starting to pay more attention to. I find it really interesting, a lot of the research that's coming out about how things like sexism and racism contribute to not only conditions like trauma, but also depression in some really complicated ways, right? It's not the only factor that would engender depression, for example, but we do have all sorts of evidence to suggest that it is a contributing factor and a factor that shapes people's experiences of depression in ways that those of us who aren't physicians, who aren't psychiatrists and psychologists, can do something about, right? I can't prescribe somebody a medicine, but I can join with my community to do something about these social injustices. And I ought to, I think, as a Christian. Another kind of communal contributing factor to depression that comes to mind concerns suicidal ideation. I'm thinking of the work of psychologist Thomas Joyner, who's one of the leading suicidologists here in the United States. And he identifies several different sort of experiences that are often present in the lives of those who are experiencing suicidal ideation, two of which are a feeling of burdensomeness, a feeling that a person that like I don't matter. So burdensomeness, and then a sense of unbelonging. I don't belong anywhere. And I am so struck every time I read Joyner's work and hear about these experiences that like these are experiences that faith communities can address. For one, like you were saying, Steph, faith communities do an awful lot to make people feel like they don't matter and that they don't belong, right? I'm thinking especially of like the high rates of suicidal ideation among the LGBTQ community. You know, look at our church, look at the United States right now, like people are being told constantly that they do not belong because they are transgender, that they don't matter, that their experiences don't matter, right? It's just so clear that it's heartbreaking. And yet, if we're willing to contend with how our faith communities contribute to experiences of burdensomeness and unbelonging, I think that's the starting point for us asking in our communities, like, what are ways that we can counter that? We can do things to communicate to people that they matter and that they belong. We can do that in our faith communities, and we can join together and advocate for policies in our country, in our communities, that better reflect those values too.
Yeah, so you've already started down this line, but just to really frame it, right? What we believe and how we practice are very connected, right? And this is a central tenet, again, of feminist theology. And so you've signaled in some ways that like faith communities can be involved. I'm also mindful of like there are 80 participants here on this call on a Wednesday night from Holy Trinity, from all across the world, recognizing some names, right? That that underscores for me like that there are people here who are invested and also maybe looking for like action, right? And not that we want to always rush the action. But what are actions for us at Holy Trinity that we could consider to embrace the mission of the church as related to theologies of mental health and mental illness, right? We've talked a little bit about what this might look like sacramentally, but I think anything around like sacramentally, ritualistically, but also communities of care and communities of belonging. What are practices? You have, 80 people signed on here. Like, how can you send us in a direction?
I'll start. Practice girl. So a couple things. I am very lucky to, as part of my role, I teach a lot of practical courses to seminarians from all Christian traditions and interreligious traditions as well. And something I'm always shocked about is a lack of intentionality around a multitude of topics that would assist in what Jess is talking about. So much like you fly a particular flag to indicate either hopefully welcome or not, we need to be that clear with our policies and our procedures around our spaces and around our intentionalities with mental health and crisis. So some of this stuff is very institutional, but I assume that some of you serve on parish councils. Our priests, our lay religious leaders are out there doing the work. Does your spaces, if you're in schools, do they have a mental health crisis plan? Do you have a literal flow chart for who to call when? Have you trained your staff in psychological first aid? Have you offered that to your clergy, to your parishioners, right? I don't think that's just a clergy issue, right? Psychological first aid can give you a script, literally, to what to say, what order to say it in, so that you don't feel overwhelmed when someone comes to you with A, B, or C, especially to Jess's point. Suicidal ideation is scary. It is normal to be freaked out if someone comes to you with the ultimate risk on themselves or others. Very fair. But do you know what to do when that happens, right? Does your church community know what it does? Not just your priest. Does your church community know what it does when something like that happens? Because the more and more, and you guys, I'm sure, have the point in time count for unhoused people was just last weekend. So the new data is not out, but I'm sure you know from wherever you live that the rate of unhoused persons has exploded in the last 2 years. And unfortunately, that's often tightly tied with mental health. Do you understand when someone walks through your doors as a house of hospitality, how you're going to be able to greet that person, how you're going to be able to hold them in their fullness and in their hope for them being able to get towards healing? And so those are some very, very, very practical things. And I also just want you guys to understand that through doing that, the research is changing on this, but somewhere to 2 times more effective are referrals in which, let's say, Annie greets the person, goes through the psychological first aid script, and then takes them to a care provider. That person is twice as likely to succeed in whatever referral that they are taken to. So that's power. Like, church communities and people in this position do have power. So as much as that sounds like Stephanie, nonprofit manager, coming in and giving you a to-do list, I only do so because of it does get us towards what I think is the gospel call to service, to life and flourishing.
Those are wonderful ideas, Steph. One of the things that comes to mind as a recommendation is what it seems like Holy Trinity is doing with this series, Annie, from what you and Brian told me about. And you haven't talked that much about the entirety of this series, but my impression from what I heard is that you're not only bringing in people to talk to the community about mental health like Steph and I, but also drawing upon experts within your own community, right? Social workers, psychologists, people who experience mental illness or whose lives have been touched by others who with mental illness. I would love to see more faith communities draw on the people who in their careers, in their day-to-day life, are already a kind of expert in some of this. Because I think not only does that help promote mental health education in a community, but it also does so with people who have an ongoing relationship and can be an ongoing resource to people there, which I think is wonderful. Another thing I would love to see more faith communities do is to make explicit connections between mental health and many of the ministries that are already happening and thriving often in their communities. So we talked about liturgy, for example. If you have a robust liturgical ministry at your parish, like what are ways that you can incorporate mental health into that, whether it's simple things like adding prayers for those who are struggling to the intercessions at Mass every week, or doing something that's a larger undertaking like a healing service or something like that. I also would love to see, building on what I said earlier, like social justice ministries and parishes engaging around some advocacy in their communities to support mental health resources or initiatives that are happening in the larger city, or even to sort of make some of these connections between racism and mental health, right? Racism is a mental health issue. Sexism is a mental health issue. Poverty is a mental health issue. Making those connections as a part of their work in those social justice ministries, I think would be huge.
There was a question in the chat that I want to add in because I think it builds upon that really well. There was a question about how might the sacrament of the anointing of the sick be engaged in this work, right? And Steph, I know you talked about the Eucharist as well, and I might expand that as like, are there other sacramental aspects that we could engage? Like there's such a richness of liturgical life, ritualistic life in the church. I'd love to hear thoughts about that.
Something I think about a lot is how Jess began, is that we want to offer spaces in which the individual, especially if it's an anointing, right, can make meaning, and especially a theological meaning, for themselves. So when I talk about mental health and theology, I always say, you may not agree with their theological interpretation of their mental health being tied to a test. That may not be comfortable for you. And there may be, we're theologians, we might want to call it wrong. But if they are otherwise able to process their faith experience in a way that is obviously moving them towards healing, that's moving them towards where they want to go, the rituals for me should open up spaces for that individual or the group to explore how they want to crack open the gospel, how they want to crack open our faith and say, where do I want to end? Where is that slice, that little bit of hope that I want to cling to out of this? Austin Channing Brown, who's a wonderful Black feminist author and Christian leader, often talks about how do we learn to do the work in the dark? Hope is not a light-filled work, it's work in the dark. And for me, I think a lot about Easter Vigil, especially around mental health. And we Catholics are incredibly lucky, I think. I'm a convert. So like I come in with a kind of, I don't want to say clear eyes, because none of us have clear eyes, really. But coming into these rituals as an adult, I think was a gift for me. Because when I got into the space of Easter Vigil, I said, oh, here it is. I got some doubt. I got some unknowing. I got some sitting in the dark to do. And I think we have these really beautiful spaces where, like I said, we don't need to impose the theology. We can crack open our faith in a way and let ourselves find our individual ways through the dark and find our individual ways to whatever healing path we need to be on. So for me, thinking about anointing and things like that is where I go. What do you think, Jess?
I'll just briefly add first, on a practical note, I do know of like a couple theologians who are writing about the sacrament of the anointing of the sick and mental illness. I'm thinking of one in particular, a colleague of ours, Cindy Cameron, who's written about this in relation to folks who are struggling with eating disorders in particular. And so if you are the question asker, feel free to email me. I would be happy to pass along how some other theologians are thinking about this. The other thing I would add briefly is that one of the beauties, I think, of the anointing of the sick and of our sacramental tradition is that it's embodied. And I think it's easy for us to think about mental illness as something in our minds, as if our minds are not part of our bodies. But actually, like so many people, when they describe what it's like to experience trauma, to experience depression, it's a profoundly embodied experience, actually. The way we are in our bodies is affected by this. It's totalizing in that way. And so I think one of the gifts of the anointing of the sick, of the other sacraments, is that these rituals engage us in our bodies that are suffering often so much with these mental conditions.
Thank you for that. Some other questions that came in, I kind of want to group together, but it's thinking about church teaching, right? So I think sometimes there's been some complicated messaging around like, does church teaching allow for taking medication or therapy like outside, like in a secular context? But also, what might be some of the resources of like Catholic social teaching that we can draw upon in thinking about this? So, how can we think about church teaching in some of these like very practical ways?
One thing I think about with things like seeing a therapist, taking medication, is that I think one of the gifts of our Catholic tradition is that the church is pretty clear in its support of science. And hopefully, right, the doctors that we're seeing are informed by the best of scientific knowledge. The psychologists or therapists we're seeing are using evidence-based practices. And so unlike sort of other Christians who are located in churches that might be kind of suspicious of science and therefore medicine, I think one thing that the Catholic Church affords actually is that it is pro-medication. It is pro-scientific psychological treatment for mental illness. And we see the truth of reason and the truth of science as being compatible and part of the same truth that our faith professes, right? This unity between faith and reason that we espouse in the Catholic Church. So I think that's one huge advantage and is really important. One thing I would say is that if one's faith is really important to them, if one's experience of mental illness is bringing up issues of faith, whether it's how one sees God or maybe it's affecting a person's participation in their spirituality or faith community, I would encourage people to be upfront with that, about that with any therapist that they're seeing. There are therapists who have secular practices. They're not Christian therapists or explicitly Catholic therapists, though they may be people of faith, and they do feel comfortable talking with a patient about those things, even if that's not a sort of part of their brand as a therapist. There are, of course, some medical doctors and therapists who don't feel as comfortable. But I think if you are explicit about that's a part of your journey with mental health, that will help you find somebody who can offer you that kind of support from their expertise as a medical doctor or a psychologist or therapist.
Yeah, and any principles from Catholic social teaching or other rich resources that we might think about mining. Also say, I know Brian's going to talk about the further series, but there is an upcoming talk in the series on, do I need a priest or a therapist? So I think we're also like, these are live questions, right? That if this is surfacing for you, yes, we have we have more where that's coming from.
Yeah, I mean, don't ask a BC ethicist to talk about CST. We'll be here for 16 years. So the one I often think about a lot with, first and foremost, is always dignity. If human dignity is your first principle of action and of faith, then no person, no matter their mental health status, no matter your perception of their functioning, has any less value or any less dignity than anyone else in your orbit or in your path that day. And that means something to us as Catholics. That's not an empty platitude about human rights. That is calls us to service, because in Catholic social teaching, we then talk about solidarity, of course. And I don't mean solidarity just nebulously. Solidarity is often written off as a nice to have as opposed to a requirement. And instead I see solidarity as something that does ask something of you. It means that at the very least, you're going to step outside of your comfort zone, and you're going to do so and in the language, risk accompaniment with the other, to truly be with someone that has been pushed aside so thoroughly by every other space. And I think that's incredibly important. I saw something flash by about how we also cause mental health crises in the church, and we know that all too well. And I think that, to Annie's question earlier, this is an opportunity for us to do the hard work, to sit in the discomfort of being in a church that has perpetuated crime, that has perpetuated abuse, that has perpetuated, at minimum, lifetimes of mental health disorders and suicidality. We are a structure that has done this. And if you cannot honestly sit with that and with then another person who may come to you with that, sit with yourself first and see how you can reason through that, and see what might be in your way, in your healing, in your faith, to hold those two truths simultaneously at the same time. That we can be in a structure that has done great harm, but also one that I can assume, at least for the three of us in the panel, gives us great hope and faith and ultimate, drive. And then finally, for me, it's subsidiarity, weirdly, maybe, because that's service and recognition of the most local making the choice when it is most impactful to them, rather than doing top down. We are a bottom up Catholic social teaching model in my church, and I believe in that deeply. And that means that the person who's coming, or the people, or the issue that's coming, needs to be led by those most impacted, and then the church follows. And that's not often the case, like Jess has talked about. But if we do that, if we take subsidiarity seriously and let those most impacted lead, we're doing something right.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time and wanting to kind of draw together where we've been. So as you know, the Holy Trinity community will be journeying on thinking about this topic, which you two have so helpfully broken open for us. What are your either parting thoughts for us, right? Or asked differently, what would be your encouragement for us as a collective community, as a parish, or us as individuals to consider in thinking about this? Maybe it's, things that you often see people jump to that you want to caution about, or a recommendation, or just a sense of like, what does hope look like in a time like this? What does community look like in a time like this?
The first thing that comes to mind is that while we've hopefully cracked open things, as you put it, Annie, and like offered some ideas for people to chew on about faith and mental illness. I know that oftentimes it can feel like a really daunting task, right? To educate oneself and one's community and put into action all of these things. So many books to read, so many people to help, so many things to do. At the end of the day, when I listen to a lot of depression sufferers, some of the things that make the biggest difference to them are things that we as Christians should already be equipped to do. So, Steph has mentioned accompaniment, right? Meeting people where they are, asking what they need, and going out of our way, if necessary, to help them. I mean, this is just the gospel. This is love. And so like that is a great place to start as we continue to learn and grow and build action plans, and all of that. Steph, what do you think?
Y'all, encouragement right now, Annie? Really? Okay.
I mean, encouragement can take different forms. It doesn't have to be,
Oh no, I know.
it doesn't have to be in an optimistic way, right? Like where do we
Yeah.
find one another in this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've been holding on to this week, as I'm sure a lot of you have, and probably why you're here, is that we simply cannot do this alone. There is absolutely no way I'm going to survive my life, let alone the next 4 years, if I don't have a community around me to support me. And in so doing, do the work that Jess is talking about. I'm sure a lot of us feel life-giving moments when we're able to be with someone to offer some comfort, to offer some glimmer of something that could be different, right? There's a great theologian with a horrifically unable to spell last name, Edward Skillabeeks, who talks about a main response to injustice can simply be not this. And sometimes that's all we need to hear is not this. It's not a plan. It's not a guarantee. But it is something that you can offer someone at any moment, is to look them in their eyes and say, not this, whatever that thing may be. I may not know what next, but this ain't it. And that, again, back to Jess's concept of small agency, what a powerful thing for us all to take away, that it doesn't have to be, I understand everything about psychology now, and therefore I'm allowed to offer comfort and be a part of this community. No, it's to say, I know that I'm doing the best I can, and I will be here with you to journey forward. And I think that, for me, is what I'm holding on to. And $2,000 in cash and a getaway van. But other than that, no, in all seriousness, this has been really life-giving for me, because I think that someone mentioned loneliness in the chat. It can feel quite isolating, even if we have great community, which I'm lucky to have. And I think that the more we're able to do this work together and to understand that we are part of a bigger network in the world that is trying to create positive change, then I think we might be okay.
Well, I thank you both for being with our community as we think through these really important topics, right? And for those of us on the call or those of us watching the recording later, I would encourage everyone to continue diving into these topics, right? This is not a log on once, listen for an hour, done, right? But an ongoing call, an ongoing vocation, an ongoing conversion. This is not a book talk, but I do highly recommend to the community both of your books, right? I think authors tend to make, 50 cents from the book. But Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression is Jessica Coblentz's book. and goes into depth into a lot of those popular theologies of depression. And where might resources be in the tradition? Then the hot off the press Enfleshed Counter-Memory, a Christian social ethic of trauma, is utilizing a lot of Johann Baptist Metz and womanist scholars to really raise the question of collective ethics and what does that look like? How can we think about communal suffering, communal memory, and what that could look like? So I highly recommend these two. Like I said, there are two big parts of my library that I'm often loaning out. And lucky for us, this again is the start of a process. So I'll turn it over to Brian to talk more about what these ongoing efforts look like at Trinity.
Thanks, Annie. Before I say that, I just want to pause and express such deep gratitude to both of our primary speakers tonight and to our moderator. You can see why I love them so much, right? It's not just because they went to the obviously best Jesuit theology faculty in the United States, Boston College, but
Santa
also
Clara
and Santa Clara
as well.
but
Go
also
Broncos.
because they are amazing humans, amazing Catholics, amazing writers, amazing thinkers. And I'm so grateful that you're able to kick off our conversation here at Holy Trinity Parish. We'll be doing a few different events in the coming weeks. We had originally thought it was a 1 month thing, and for various reasons, we're going to be expanding it out a little bit, just to give you a little sense of some upcoming things, all of which will be on the Adult Faith Formation website. And then once I'm back from my trip, I'll be doing our weekly Adult Faith Formation emails again. You can sign up for those there as well. All of which will be ways of continuing to think about this together. So on February 15th, to do some more practice and not just thinking about this, we'll be borrowing the National Cathedral's portable labyrinth. So we're going to have a labyrinth set up in the Trinity Hall for all day that Saturday. If you want to have some meditative time, and then we'll be also thinking about how do you do Ignatian, a way of encountering labyrinth practice. On Sunday, February 23rd, during the 10:15 hour between masses, and on a night to be determined a day or two later on Zoom, we'll be having our conversation on do I need a priest or a counselor, and how do very practically our needs for our spiritual growth and conversation, our needs for our mental health work together, and how do you know where to go? And we're hoping to have some other speakers. We're having somebody from the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers. So we'll be doing a few different things. I'm very grateful to our speakers tonight for kicking us off. And someone asked a question in the chat about access to this recording. Once the recording is done, we'll be putting it up on our parish YouTube channel in coming weeks. So thank you very much. Thank you for the richness of this conversation on this important topic, for your service to the church and to the theological community. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again in another thing in coming times. Be well.
They announce all these things, and then like what's going to